All right. So welcome everyone. And I'm Justin David, and I'm here with Mawali and Morgan Peters. And we are graduates of Music and Art and Performing Arts, LaGuardia, 1986. And just a reminder, about a week and a half ago, I posted an idea on the LaGuardia 1986 alumni page that there are all these fascinating people doing really beautiful things in the world, and we see each other on Facebook, and we read our posts and we share each other's posts, and I always feel like I always want to know more about the people who are posting, and also the people who are not posting. And so about a week and a half ago, I floated an idea on the Facebook page that I would connect with people and ask them to share about their work and their lives and their path, how they got to this place, and have these really informal conversations that we post on Facebook, and people really seem to love that idea. So we're going to do it. And this is not a professional interview by any means. It's just a conversation. Got my coffee cup. You got your coffee cup?
Well, actually, yeah. Hang on. I drink travel mug size, but yeah.
Ooh. Morgan has his kitty cat with him. So we'll just jump right in. And Morgan, I wanted to start with you because you're someone who posts on Facebook and you share your work, which I think if you're an artist or a teacher or anyone, right, I think you have an obligation to share your work, and you do that generously. And over the years, I've been Facebook friends with you for a long time. Full disclosure, Morgan and I go back to the viola section in the LaGuardia Orchestra. But I've been watching your stuff for a long time, and what's remarkable to me, there are many things that are remarkable, is how many different things that you do. I'm just going to read off a list of notes that I took here. So perhaps most importantly, Morgan, you're a father. You have a teenage son who seems to be becoming a musician and producer in his own right. But you have a day job as an associate professor in the English department, teaching African American literature and English and communication and drama. You have a band. You are involved in the Mashpee Wampanoag community. And you've just written this novel called Black Squirrel, which I've started to read. It's really a beautiful, very lyrical, sensual novel about, well, you can tell us what it's about. So tell us about your book, and what it means to you to write this book and have it out there in the world.
All right. The book, or Land of the Black Squirrels, it's funny to say, what is it about? It's a story about the lives of some people. They're musicians, and it just sort of follows some young folks. It also follows a couple of different generations. So it starts with their parents and then jets forward to their experiences growing up in the Bronx in the 80s and 90s, but also with the background of being musicians and being artists, and how that sort of, just in terms of your experience of the world, puts you in a rather different place.
Yeah.
And was just trying to really, how so? I even just think of the simple thing. I remember in Spike Lee's Mo Better Blues, he captures at the very beginning of the movie where the guy has to practice.
Yeah.
And I think about, you think about that. Oh, I'm watching this TV show. Oh, I got to go play scales. My friends are going to do such and such. Oh, but I got to be back home because I have this new Telemann piece that I have to learn. I see you laughing, so I know you remember that experience very well. but that automatically sort of puts you in, I learned a different mindset. And what I begin to also find is this begins to also shape your friends, who you become friends with.
Mm-hmm.
After a while, you begin to notice, and I noticed this about, and I was wondering, well, this is probably just the case of we go to a school like LaGuardia. But then as I began to speak to musicians who did not go to LaGuardia and find out they were friends with the local musicians, It's just that musicians sort of start to form their own little social groups, their own little social communities, and artists in an extended form. Because what will happen is you'll find a group of people. This one plays an instrument, that one plays an instrument. The one guy who doesn't play an instrument is probably a painter or a poet or something along those lines. But there's something about the creative faculty and that habit of mind that sort of like almost draws or dictates our friendships as young people, I noticed. So I was just trying to capture that sort of element as well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So let's jump to LaGuardia for a second. I mean, here you are, and my sense of heart of the book is that it has a pretty expansive timeline, but it seems to me that the heart of it is is somewhat drawn on experiences that you had growing up in the Bronx in the 70s and 80s, and
Yeah.
what was it like for you as a young person with an artistic sensibility? What did you look to in your neighborhood, and did you find that in your neighborhood, and then you went to M&A, and did you find it there? How did that all work for you?
It worked well because where I grew up, Northeast Bronx in Co-op City, we actually had a wonderful arts program in our middle schools. So you had there too, even say I would say the experience from about fifth grade on. Again, you're around everybody plays an instrument or is doing something along those lines. When you're growing up in a community, you find that there are, one thing that I also have to recognize with music, it was part of the education
Yeah,
at one point, in general, as funny as it sounds to point that out. So that as you got to the older generation, even the people who now were not actively musicians, at one point or another studied an instrument
yeah,
or studied some aspect of the arts. So it was a wonderful place to grow up in that regard because of the fact that art was so much just a part of the life. Music was so much a part of the life.
mhm,
The other thing I appreciated about co-op in those days, it was a very, very diverse community.
hmm,
So you had exposures to a range of cultures and a range of cultural traditions, and
yeah,
also, and with that, a range of musical experiences and a range of musical traditions.
yeah.
So I think that growing up in that place at that time, I think was a major contributor. Because the other thing was there were a lot of kids. I remember, same year as us, few years behind us. Hard to think of us as kids now, 52. But anyway, a few kids behind us, a few kids ahead of us, who went to LaGuardia, who were all from the same neighborhood.
Yeah.
So, it was
Wow.
sort of normalized, I guess you could say.
Wow. So you had that support growing up in your neighborhood and in your school.
Oh,
Sounds like.
oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Because a lot of people
And
come
then
from neighborhoods.
family musicians and so forth.
Yeah. Wait, a
I'm
family
sorry?
of musicians?
Oh, I was saying that, because my grandfather was a pianist, and when he
Wow.
came to this country, led a jazz band and
Wow.
arranged for a myriad of other bands, including Count Basie. My mother was an opera singer.
Wow.
My mother's still with us, but doesn't sing anymore. But she sang for many years with the Amato Opera Company in New York,
Wow.
and so the house was full of music.
Wow. So
As
that sounds amazing. Uh, what were the influences in your house growing up? Tell us more about that. What's the music you heard in your house, in your neighborhood?
let's see. I'll start within the house. Well, I heard a lot of Maria Callas growing
Wow.
up. Um, my mother's a coloratura, so I heard a considerable amount of opera and of course comparative versions of Verdi and so forth. And um, it's funny, the live from the Met broadcast. I remember it was always interesting if they were doing a live from the Met simulcast the same night that they would do the broadcast on Channel 13 on PBS,
Uh-huh.
because then we would be hearing the opera in stereo as my mother would tune it in. She had this Telefunken with these great speakers, so we would watch the opera and then have it in like full stereo at the same time. But that's a memory. That's a specific memory. And but she was also very much into soul music. A lot of the stuff from the late 50s and in the 60s. So I grew up listening to a lot of Wilson Pickett and Aretha Franklin and James Brown and so I guess you could say it was an interesting range of music in the house. And then my great uncle, who was also my godfather, he was a jazz fan, so that was my exposure to a lot of Miles Davis and John Coltrane and Coleman Hawkins and Jimmy Smith, the jazz organist, who I think I wore that record out. And of course, you had my biological grandfather, who was basically a concert pianist who switched to jazz. So I'm hearing both from him. I'm hearing the romantic classics, and then I'm hearing him go into "It Don't Mean a Thing If It Ain't Got That Swing" or tunes like that. And my grandpa, who was basically my step grandfather, he had been a violinist many years before. He was actually an accountant by now, but he was still very much a symphonic fan. So I would come home from school hearing the symphony play. So yeah, that's, I guess, all of those different things. You have music all around.
Wow. Well, it's
Kind of does
amazing.
it.
It's an amazing array of influences, and I can only imagine what that's like for you as a young person having all this coming at you. Um,
It's
yeah,
that's the funny thing. As a young person, you don't really think about it in terms of the cultural impact. It's just that this is the music you're hearing.
yeah,
You're hearing because you leave the house, and of course, I'm forgetting my mother also had this big calypso collection of like all the calypso records from Barbados that relatives would send her. So so that was in the house. But then you leave the house and you're hearing those musics, but then you're also hearing like Latin Caribbean music. And you leave the house and you're hearing, I remember actually playing with a couple of groups, but like the klezmer, for example, I remember that.
hmm,
And it might sound funny, but later on when I got more so into playing jazz and funk, I particularly began to listen to that music very heavily.
yeah.
And then to completely throw it into a different direction, there was a guy who lived near us who used to practice his bagpipes out next to the Hutchinson River. So I used to get to hear that in the afternoon.
Wow.
And I'm actually a big fan of bagpipe music.
Yeah.
And it was on my bucket list of instruments to learn. But so you put all those pieces together, yeah, you find that you're hearing a little everything.
Wow. Well. So let me ask you a question, and I'm gonna, I have a memory from high school, you know, that I wonder how you respond to this, if this kind of resonates with your experience of music and art and then LaGuardia. And there was a teacher. This was at the old PA building that I heard this, and
Hmm.
a senior teacher in the department was talking to the music students, and he said, "Disco is the comic book of music." And at the time, of course, he meant it as the insult that it was. Yeah, and yeah, there's some disco that's totally cheesy and whatever, but there's a deeper sting there, right? You're saying, and this is an older white man, classical is it. And anything that comes, anything that's popular, anything that's black, anything that's different is just not okay. And, I don't remember anyone responding to that particularly negatively at the time. Like no one it was also the times no one challenged him. But I shudder to think, what it was like for you coming from this environment where you have all these musical all these musical influences. They're all really powerful. They're all really nourishing. in high school, did you come across teachers who kind of arranged a hierarchy, and or did you see something different?
I definitely recognize the hierarchy in terms of the belief, in terms of musical beliefs by some of the teachers. But the other piece, it's funny you mentioned that, because one of the things that hit me at the spot
Yeah.
was recognizing the blatant racial biases
Yeah.
that teachers would have in terms of comments and conversations around classical music.
Mm-hmm.
It was, I remember we had a substitute teacher, and ironic, this was back in the old music and art building. We had a substitute teacher who ironically was substituting for, well, now Dr. Washington. And of course, Dr. Washington is African-American Cherokee.
Yeah.
So, well, this woman's belief was that Black people aren't supposed to play classical, aren't meant to play classical, that we don't have the aptitude to actually play it as well.
She said that?
Yes.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, and this was, this was Dr. Washington's sub.
Yeah.
And it was interesting to hear a comment, hear a comment like that. I would have been a sophomore.
Mm-hmm.
But then it became even more interesting, and this was actually our orchestra, when I remember our conductor making what I call the dog whistle speech, and it pretty much altered my ability to respect him for the rest of our time in that orchestra.
Wow.
When he one day decided to make a speech about how the caliber of this orchestra has gone down over the years, because the types of students who once upon a time would have gone to LaGuardia, performing arts and music and art, now live in the suburbs. And we're left with who's in the city. And I remember that speech verbatim, because I remember sitting there in the viola section wondering, is this man really saying this? And I'm looking at Vincent Craig in the cello section. I'm looking around the orchestra at who's left in the city. And it was funny, because the string sections, the classical sections, if you will, were never, we were never the sections, I would say, dominated by students of color. That was more vocal music. And you would even see that with Mr. Chocho in the jazz section. But I'm looking around, and this is probably the largest number of kids of color this orchestra has ever had. And this is the speech that he decides to make. So yeah, my ability to respect him from that day on, was gone.
Oh my gosh.
But then a similar situation happened with music history, when we start studying about Beethoven.
Mm-hmm.
And I raise is what I just think is an interesting anecdote, that it was my understanding that Beethoven was a Black German.
Hmm.
And now what I was expecting was a response like you just gave, huh, really? I instead was told that's got to be the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life, yada, blah, blah. I mean, went into a litany. So, I could have accepted, I don't believe that, but the dumbest thing I've ever heard made me go, if you remember, we were behind the Lincoln Center Library at LaGuardia.
Yeah.
I remember going to the Lincoln Center Library and finding the book that said Beethoven's mother was from Morocco.
Oh, wow.
She was of the, and that there was a sizable Moorish population in Germany at the time. And that his mother was of this group, and that his father, in fact, was the one who sort of married into this Moorish family. So I go to said teacher with the book, and I'm immediately ejected from the class. So yeah, that was some of the less pleasant memories of LaGuardia, and unfortunately, some of the less pleasant elements within the mindset of the teachers. I mean, one thing that I think also told me about how people sometimes get their spirit beaten out of them is this was the same teacher who tried to apologize for or explain the anti-Semitism of Wagner. And he himself was Jewish. And I'm like sitting there saying, yeah, good for you. I don't think I could do that.
Yeah.
I mean, combined with the fact that I don't particularly care for Wagner, music anyway. I find it. Now you want to talk about disco.
Mm-hmm.
Wagner was basically disco without drums.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing over and over and over. But anyway, I digress. But those were some of the interesting, or I should say, defining experiences at LaGuardia in terms of my thoughts on music and musicality, and even just in terms of music, the attitude about music.
I feel like,
Luckily, I was always, luckily in cases like that, I was always more of I will take it under advisement than I will internalize it kind of person. So,
how do you mean?
but, um, some of the statements that these teachers made, I know people internalize, and you talk to them now and they still carry them.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't internalize them like I did, like, wow, you're really messed up. And now it's going to make me question everything you're teaching me. Instead, they internalized and it made them question themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So when I say take it under advisement, you tell me something that doesn't sound quite right, I'll take it and I will internalize it, but internalize it in that I'm processing it.
Right, right.
And, I'm pretty sure these teachers didn't expect to be anecdotes in a public conversation 30 something years after the statement. You know what I mean? So yeah, it's that kind of thing.
It's deeply powerful. I mean, I'm just listening to you talk about this, and um, my memory jumps back to those days. And as a teenager, I just remember seeing you and seeing other people just being happy-go-lucky. A teacher will do their thing, period ends, and you're picking up your
Mm-hmm.
bags and you're moving on to the next thing. But I actually remember, first of all, we sat next to each other in orchestra, so we both heard that speech.
Mm-hmm.
And what
Mm-hmm.
I remember, I don't remember that speech exactly, but I remember a variation on that theme that the same teacher talked about. And I know exactly who you're talking about and which year it was, right?
Mm-hmm.
But he said the same thing. And, of course, me being a white kid, it didn't hit me the same way. It just, and
Mm.
but of course, you know, I think you're absolutely right that that was a dog whistle. Um, and I just can't imagine what that was like for you as a young person, with great integrity, pulling up, having all this music, this sense of self, this, your background, and taking this education to go out in the world as an artist, and hearing this sense, hearing this from this teacher, I can't imagine what that's like.
It's funny because I think the other advantage of coming from a musical family, you
Yeah.
kind of expect that. You're taught to expect that kind of attitude.
Mm-hmm.
Because what I look at is this was considered one of the ironies in my family.
Mm-hmm.
My grandfather played jazz when he got to this country because at that point, we're talking about the 1920s, Black people did not play classical.
Mm-hmm.
Or if they did, they went and had a career in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
But you didn't have concert pianists in the United States. who were black. So jazz was the avenue that he had to pursue.
Yeah.
And one of the funny points was that I studied classical, I liked classical, but I loved jazz.
Yeah.
And that was what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And so it was sort of like he was, you know, my first piano teacher. So it was the interesting thing of here was a classical pianist who had to play jazz. And here was somebody who had an opportunity to do classical, but really wanted to play jazz.
Yeah.
But also understanding that it was the same American mindset that kept him out of the classical arena.
Mm.
It was the same mindset that, you know, my mother sang with the Amato Opera Company. All of her peers who wanted to go beyond the Amato Opera Company had to go to Europe because the Met was not going to sign them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So you go into a school like music and art understanding, especially as a classical player, this is the mindset, this is the likely mindset of the teachers that you're going to have. This is the likely mindset of the field that you're going into.
Mm-hmm.
And recognizing, you know, for example, when you had somebody like a Dr. Washington in the school, and everybody's like, oh, Dr. Washington is wonderful. But then when you get to know Dr. Washington, realize as a musician, she is leagues ahead of her colleagues. Her musical knowledge is leagues ahead of her colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
This is a woman who speaks several languages, you know, who earned her doctorate while she was teaching at the high school, you know, several years in, and you realize it goes back to the Booker T. Washington concept of twice as good to be an equal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This is what you saw, because the interesting thing when you looked at, you know, when you look at it along those lines, when you looked at the black teachers, and this is not to say that we had teachers who, you know, all of the teachers were incredible. I have to say, you know, were incredible musicians and music educators. But what I noticed looking back is that when you had the black teachers, both Mrs. Washington's music, you know, vocal and instrumental, when you had people like Mrs. Del Val, when you look at the caliber of musicianship and the caliber of teacher that the black teachers were, they were head and shoulders above their peers, or I should say many of.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Many of. So, you know, so that kind of thing exists, and that kind of thing, you know, is to, like I said, that attitude is to be expected.
Mm-hmm.
And I even look at one of our peers who's an amazing pianist. And I remember a conversation we had in high school in terms of talking about jazz, and his fear of playing jazz was that he needed to show them that we can play something else. And my question to him is, and who are they that we have to prove something to?
Yeah. Yeah. That's
But, you know,
yeah.
so you know, that becomes that's, you know, but that again is just part of the experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, you know, you're happy, you know, and I guess you're able to be happy-go-lucky because when something like that happens, it's along the lines of falling down when you're ice skating.
Hmm.
It's something that's an invariable and is going to happen, but, you know, it doesn't really diminish your enjoyment of the ice skating.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. But for other people, it did, right?
Yeah.
You said you took it
Oh,
under
yeah.
advisement, but for some people, it really kind of crushed them.
Yeah.
Yeah, artistically.
Yeah.
Don Byron, in recent days, I happen to be Facebook friends with Don Byron, and for people who don't know who he is, he's he's a great clarinetist, African-American man, who's early 60s. And like you, he's a multi-genre guy, he's a multi-instrumentalist. But in recent days, he's been posting about what his experience was like. He went to the Manhattan School of Music and then went to the New England Conservatory. And you know, and he's talking about the deeply painful experiences of being someone who was encountering this kind of, belittlement and delegitimization, dehumanization at every turn. And it's really, really compelling to read, to read what he's been writing on Facebook. So let me ask you something. Where, first of all, just a thing about Dr. Paula Washington. I happened to catch up with her on Facebook. She was my favorite teacher who I never had. She was the teacher I always wanted to have, but never got to have. And she was a math teacher, right? And at least when we were there, and I saw that she got her doctorate. It turns out, in the small world category.
Well, no, she
Yeah.
was strings.
She was strings.
She was strings. Her ex-husband, well, a husband at the time, Mr. Murphy, taught math. But no, she was the string. She taught strings, ensemble, violin, etc. Yeah.
I so didn't realize.
And in her own right, an outstanding violist.
Yeah, yeah. I know someone who I went to college with, who's also a violist, who's her coach at chamber music summer thing that she's gone to over many, many years and loves her, which is really, really cool. So she was the greatest teacher I never had, and I always loved talking to her if I had her in a study hall or something like that. Really, really dynamic, very deep person. But I want to come back to something. Yeah. If if you didn't get the support to be the kind of artist you wanted to be and needed to be for who you were at M&A or LaGuardia, where did you find that support, and where did you go to look for it, and how did other influences help you become who you are?
I always found I was never afraid to ask questions. And, I always thought the worst somebody can tell you is no. So, I was in, and there were things that I was interested in that you couldn't get at LaGuardia. I was interested in the whole process of recording, and we were going to have a recording studio, but it would be long after we graduated that it would be finished and ready and up and running and we could learn in it. So I found myself going to the recording studios in Manhattan, the Planet Studios, House of Hits, I think it was called, something like that, not House of Hits. Anyway, going to these different studios, and I would ask if they would let me just watch what was going on. And Planet was the most, I would say, amenable to that. So I used to find myself hanging at Planet Studio and watching the process of people making records, and, completely fell in love. That was how I ended up doing my first bit of studio work, session playing, was because I just happened to be there and they needed a string player to fatten out the synthesized string parts. So they wanted to add real strings and layer them in. So that, at 16, I became a session player for EMI, haha. But
Wow.
And that was how that kind of thing happened. And I also found with jazz, we had Mr. DeChocho,
yes,
a wonderful, wonderful educator.
Yes. Yeah.
And what I found myself doing was going more and more into the jazz world. One thing that actually I would say led me head on, and it was very funny, it was actually Cape Cod that did it. In the summer of 1985, I went to see James Brown at the Melody Tent in Hyannis. And at the end of the show, waited after so I could get autographs and talk to the musicians. Well, he had a trombone player by the name of Haji, who said, "Oh, you play piano?" Because what I actually brought for them to sign, and I still have it on my shelf, I brought my real book. Huh. The jazz fake book that back in the day was illegal to buy because it was, well, I had a real book. So I had them all sign the real book, and Haji signed it, and he said, "You live in New York?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Oh, well, here, I'm going to give you this. When you get back to New York, you need to go see this guy." And he gave me a flyer for the Jazz Cultural Theater, and the person that he sent me to see was the great Barry Harris, the jazz pianist, who then became, and it was kind of funny how that happened, because a couple of months before my grandfather had passed away. So I was without a piano teacher. And this is how Barry Harris then became my next piano teacher.
Wow.
But going to Barry Harris at the Jazz Cultural Theater, I also then began to frequent the Jazz Cultural Theater. So you're hearing all of this jazz. And then I began to, and for meeting the people there, finding out that, well, yeah, you need to be 21 to get into the Blue Note, but not for the after hours. So I would go to the after hours at the Blue Note, and I got to jam there. So I'm hanging there, and I'm at the Village Gate, and I'm also sometimes going to the Lenox Lounge up in Harlem, where they still will sometimes play jazz. So I'm slipping into, again, as a high schooler, slipping into this jazz world that is sort of peripheral to music and art, and slipping into the studio world that's peripheral to music and art.
Yeah.
And here too, it's funny because you have all of these guys who were the musicians, and they were the big kids. You were in middle school, and these were the big kids with the basses and the guitars and the drums and so forth. And you were just the annoying little kid riding your bike around. Well, now you're a high school kid with an instrument. These same big kids are now all of a sudden like, hey, I'm doing a jam session down at this. You want to come play? Or, that, and it's like, wow, he wants me to come play. Oh yeah, sure, bet. So, going to the rehearsal halls with the older guys, the kids who are now in college, sitting in on their sessions. So, when you talk about the outside community, and then of course also, I was part of a church, Episcopal Church, St. Joseph's, up in the Bronx, and they were very, very supportive of what young people were doing and tried to encourage us by having us present in church and that sort of thing. So giving concerts at the church and working with the musicians at the church and who were part of the church. I guess that, became part of the outside influence.
Beautiful. Well, I'm afraid
one quick one, I'm sorry,
No,
that I also have to point to. I remember getting a flyer about an audition down in Bushwick, Brooklyn, and going to the audition in Bushwick, Brooklyn at a recording studio, and it turned out to be a recording studio that was owned by a cult.
Which one?
The Nubian Islamic Hebrews, Dr. York.
Oh my
who's
God.
now, I think, doing life in prison for any number of things, but his cult was based on Hart Street in Brooklyn. It was a really, really like burnt out part of Brooklyn. I remember getting off the subway, looking around, and it looked like like somebody had bombed the place.
Wow.
And I'm then walking towards the address, and all of a sudden in the middle, it's like these beautiful buildings, and of course these armed guards marching up and down. And realizing that, okay. So that was one of my interesting outside music experiences also.
Oh man. Was that the last time?
I also became a session player there for a little while.
What was that place called? The Nubian?
The Nubian Islamic Hebrews.
Oh my goodness. I gotta look that up.
Well, at that point, they referred to themselves as the Ansar Allah community. You used to see them out on the sidewalk, sometimes in white robes. They would sell incense, and they had different tracts and books. Books were actually rather interesting. Incense smelled rather good, but yeah.
Wow. Well. Amazing. I unfortunately I have a hard deadline. I need to run off. But
Okay.
Thank you for opening yourself up like this. And there's so many questions that I have that I didn't get to. Maybe we'll do a part 2 for the public. But certainly, I want to connect with you more and just learn more about what you're doing. And in the meantime, if people are checking this out, tell us the title of the book where we can find it.
Oh, sure. Name of the book is Land of the Black Squirrels. It's by 33 Pages Publishing, and you can find it pretty much Barnes and Noble, Amazon. It's both in paperback and you can get it electronically. If you go to the 30-3pages.com/books website, you can actually order a signed copy directly from the publisher. Publisher started doing that when we had the COVID lockdown.
Cool.
So,
Cool.
but yeah, but you know, all the normal places. It's Land of the Black Squirrels, and of course, my pen name MWALIM, Walim.
We have to talk about that too sometime. I have to hear what that's about.
Oh yeah.
And I have to hear about your family and just so much more we didn't get to. But that's what happens. You know, we start talking about work, and we start talking about each other's lives, and each of us is an epic. And such a privilege to share this time with you. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you, bro. Thank you. But yeah, let's definitely connect off camera and keep chatting.